Long before governments banned cannabis, a colonial government tried to make people grow it. In 1619, Virginia's first General Assembly ordered householders who possessed hemp seed to plant a trial crop. 13 years later, authorities issued a broader command to obtain hemp and flax seed and sow them. They were not trying to make anyone intoxicated. They were trying to supply an empire. The age of sale depended on wood, wind, canvas, and enormous quantities of rope. Hemp fibers raised sails, secured cargo, repaired nets, and kept ships under control. A navy that could not replace worn rigging could not remain at sea. But hemp did not leave the field as rope. Someone had to cut the stalks, soak them, dry them, crush their woody cores, scrape away waste, and drag the fibers through iron teeth. On farms shaped by slavery and bound labor, that work could be demanded from people who owned neither the land nor the value created from their bodies. By the time the cordage reached a harbor, the labor inside it had become almost invisible. History remembered the ship, the captain, and the empire. It rarely remembered the hands that made the rope. So how did a common cannabis crop become important enough for governments to command its cultivation, and who paid the price before it reached the sea? Before cannabis became a symbol of crime, medicine, rebellion, or modern lifestyle, it was something far less dramatic. It was fiber. For thousands of years, people cultivated varieties of cannabis sativa for stalks, seeds, oil, cordage, cloth, and food. In small communities, the plant did not arrive with police, pharmacies, or political arguments. It arrived as a material that could be cut, dried, stripped, twisted, and put to work. A fisher could turn its fibers into a net. A farmer could use them for rope. A household could spin them into coarse cloth or bind tools with a cord strong enough to survive repeated strain. The value was visible in the hand. It held, tied, carried, and endured. That older identity is easy to miss because modern language divides cannabis into categories people in the ancient and colonial worlds would not have recognized in the same way. Today, law often separates industrial hemp from other cannabis by chemistry, especially by the concentration of delta-9 THC. That boundary matters in a laboratory, a courtroom, or a licensing office, but it is a modern legal line. Earlier, societies usually understood the plant through use. Some varieties were valued for fiber, others were used for seed, oil, medicine, or ritual. These were cultivated forms within the broader cannabis genus, selected and handled for different traits. There was no single cannabis story. For the history of the colonial world, however, the stalk matters most. Imagine a family working near the edge of a field. Tall plants have been cut and laid down to dry. One person separates the long outer fibers from the harder inner core. Another twists those fibers together. The finished cord is plain, rough, and practical. It may close a sack, secure a load, repair a fishing net, or tether an animal. Nothing in the scene suggests conquest. Yet the technology inside that simple cord could be enlarged. A village needed rope by the armful. A ship needed it by the mile. A fishing boat might depend on a few nets and lines. A naval fleet required rigging, replacement cordage, sail controls, anchor lines, and stores of fiber ready for constant repair. That difference in scale changed the plant's history. As European states pushed farther across the oceans, hemp ceased to be only a household material. It became part of the physical machinery that allowed ships to move soldiers, settlers, goods, weapons, and captive people from one shore to another. The demand around it had become enormous. Cannabis first entered the machinery of empire, not because of what its flowers could do to the mind, but because of what its fibers could hold together. And once power moved onto the sea, the question was no longer whether hemp was useful. It was whether enough of it could be grown, processed, and controlled. The age of sale transformed hemp from a useful material into a strategic necessity. A wooden warship looked powerful because of its cannon, its height, and the flag above its stern. But much of its movement depended on a web of lines most people barely noticed. Standing rigging supported the masts. Running rigging raised, lowered, and adjusted the sails. Other ropes secured boats, controlled heavy equipment, tied down cargo, and helped sailors move loads that no man could lift alone. Every command on deck eventually became a pull on a line. Now imagine a sailor leaning over the rail after weeks at sea. Salt has stiffened the cordage. Moisture has entered the fibers. A section has rubbed against wood until the outer strands begin to separate. He runs his hand along the damaged rope, checking how much strength remains. The line cannot simply be ignored. If it fails under pressure, a sail may become uncontrollable. A yard may swing loose. A mast may lose support. Men can be injured, cargo lost, and the ship left unable to maneuver at the moment movement matters most. Rope was therefore not a permanent part of a vessel. It was a consumable material. The sea wore it down. Navies required replacement cordage, spare fiber, skilled rope makers, and a supply system capable of delivering all three. The larger the fleet, the greater the demand. Commercial ships, fishing vessels, dockyards, and military fleets competed for many of the same materials. Hemp was only one part of this maritime system. Ships also depended on timber, iron, tar, pitch, flax, canvas, food, and thousands of skilled workers. But good cordage could not be improvised from patriotic speeches or naval ambition. It had to come from fields. For Britain, this created an uncomfortable dependency. The state that expanded its power across the oceans could not produce all the hemp its maritime economy required. Large quantities came through Russia and the Baltic region, where climate, land, established processing traditions, and relatively inexpensive labor supported extensive production. At a Baltic port, an English merchant might stand beside bundles of pale, combed fiber waiting for shipment. He checks their length, cleanliness, and strength. Poorly prepared hemp can produce unreliable rope. Contaminated or short fibers may reduce the quality of the finished cordage. To the farmer who grew it, the bundle was an agricultural product. To the merchant, it was cargo. To the Admiralty, it was naval supply. That difference in perspective gave the crop political weight. A disruption in trade could raise prices or delay deliveries. A war, embargo, diplomatic crisis, or failed harvest could expose how much British shipping depended on land and labor, far beyond Britain itself. This was one of the great contradictions of maritime power. A government could send fleets to protect trade routes, seize territory, and intimidate rivals. Yet the fleet itself remained dependent on long chains of materials arriving from places it did not fully control. The stronger the navy became, the more replacement material it consumed. The farther its ships traveled, the more they wore out. And the more Britain relied on imported hemp, the more attractive another possibility became. Instead of purchasing so much fiber from distant suppliers, why not make the colonies grow it? That idea changed the role of cannabis again. Hemp was no longer merely a crop that happened to be useful at sea. It became a plant governments wanted to transplant, regulate, and build into the geography of expansion. Empire would not simply buy the fiber. It would try to move the field. A small sack of seed comes ashore with the cargo. It does not look like conquest. There is no banner, no cannon, no ceremony. A clerk records it. A planter inspects it. Somewhere beyond the port, a patch of ground is cleared for a crop that has already crossed an ocean. This was one of the quieter habits of empire. European expansion did not move only soldiers, priests, livestock, and weapons. It also moved plants, wheat, sugarcane, grapes, flax, mulberry trees, and hemp traveled with colonial ambition because conquered territory was expected to reproduce the materials that imperial economies required. Hemp belonged to that project. By the middle of the 16th century, Spanish colonizers were attempting to establish cannabis as a fiber crop in the Americas. The exact dates and locations of the earliest successful plantings are difficult to state with certainty. Later, histories often repeat the year 1545 as a clean beginning, but the surviving story is less precise than the date suggests. What is clear is the intention. Spanish shipping needed rope, sail-related materials, nets, and repair supplies. Producing hemp closer to American ports promised to reduce the cost and delay of carrying every bundle of fiber from Europe. A crop grown across the Atlantic might help support the vessels that connected colonial settlements to the wider empire. But moving seed was easier than moving a supply chain. Hemp required suitable soil, timing, moisture, knowledge, and labor. Fiber quality depended not only on how the plant grew, but on when it was harvested and how carefully it was retted, dried, broken, and cleaned. A royal order could demand production. It could not make unfamiliar ground behave like a field in Spain. Picture a small experimental plot near a colonial settlement. The stalks rise, but unevenly. Some are too coarse. Others mature at the wrong time. Workers cut and soak them, only to discover that the resulting fiber is weaker or dirtier than buyers expect. The crop exists, yet the naval material the authorities wanted has not truly been created. That gap mattered. Colonial planners often imagined nature as something that could be reorganized by instruction. Move the seed, assign the land, direct the labor, wait for the commodity. Reality resisted. Climate changed the plant. Local water changed the retting process. Distance separated officials from the people doing the work. Colonial authorities expected local, coerced, and imported labor systems to supply the work. Settlers pursued crops that offered faster or more certain returns. A field could fail even when officials still wanted what it was supposed to produce. This did not make hemp unimportant. It made the crop part of a larger imperial experiment, the attempt to rebuild European systems of production on occupied land. The seed carried more than a plant. It carried an expectation that American soil would serve ships, markets, and military power elsewhere. It carried the assumption that land could be reassigned, labor redirected, and ecosystems made useful according to distant priorities. A stalk growing beside a colonial road might appear local. Its purpose was not. It belonged to a network stretching from fields to storehouses, from storehouses to ports, and from ports to vessels moving through the Atlantic. Empire had begun by purchasing hemp from other regions. Now it was trying something more ambitious. It was trying to plant its supply chain. In the summer of 1619, Virginia's first General Assembly met inside the Jamestown Church. Virginia's representatives were confronting a colony that remained fragile. Disease, hunger, unstable trade, and repeated failures had already shown how difficult it was to turn an English settlement into a profitable possession. The men gathered there were not debating cannabis as medicine or intoxication. They were searching for commodities. Virginia needed products that could be grown, processed, exported, and sold. Tobacco was beginning to offer that possibility. But colonial authorities did not yet know how completely it would dominate the economy. They also considered flax, silkgrass, mulberry trees, grapes, and hemp. One line from the laws passed that year would later become one of the most repeated claims in American cannabis history. According to the popular version, every farmer in Virginia was ordered to grow hemp. The surviving language was narrower. Householders who already possessed hemp seed were instructed to make a trial of it during the following season. The law did not prove that hemp was already a major crop. It showed that officials wanted to discover whether it could become one. That distinction matters. A successful commodity required more than official enthusiasm. Farmers needed seed. They needed suitable land, experience, processing equipment, buyers, and enough labor to complete the work. Most importantly, they needed a reason to choose hemp over crops that promised a faster or more predictable return. Tobacco gave them one. Imagine a planter standing at the edge of two fields. In one, tobacco leaves are approaching harvest. Merchants already understand the product. Prices may rise or fall, but the market exists. In the other field, hemp stalks must still be cut, retted, dried, broken, cleaned, and prepared before the fiber can be sold. A poor harvest is costly. Poor processing may ruin even a good one. The plant may be useful to the colony, but usefulness does not guarantee profit for the person growing it. Colonial policy tried to close that gap. In 1632, Virginia authorities issued stronger instructions concerning hemp and flax, calling on planters to obtain seed and sow it as soon as possible. In later decades, officials experimented with bounties, purchasing arrangements, and rules that allowed certain obligations to be paid with approved commodities. These measures reveal how governments attempted to manufacture an agricultural market. First, They declared a material important. Then they encouraged production. If encouragement failed, they strengthened the language. But the field did not obey as easily as the statute book. Hemp occupied land that could be used for something else. Processing required time during a labor calendar already crowded with planting, harvesting, construction, food production, and tobacco work. Transporting bulky stalks or fiber added another cost. Even when officials wanted hemp, local buyers and processing facilities were not always ready to absorb it. That was the central problem. The colony wanted the strategic value of hemp without always possessing the infrastructure that made hemp commercially attractive. This tension continued through the 17th and 18th centuries. Some farmers adopted it. Certain regions found it more practical than others. Large planters experimented with it. Newspapers published instructions. Governments periodically renewed incentives. Yet hemp never displaced tobacco as Virginia's defining export. The famous laws, therefore, tell a more complicated story than the myth. They do not show a colony effortlessly covered in cannabis fields. They show administrators trying to direct private land toward public and imperial needs. They show an economy still being designed through commands, experiments, and pressure. A government could place hemp in a law. It could not place profit in the farmer's hand. And even when the crop grew successfully, the hardest transformation had not yet begun. The stalk still had to become fiber. That required labor. The hardest part of growing hemp began after the plant had already been cut. A field of tall stalks could look like a finished crop. To an official reading production figures, the harvest might appear complete, but the material wanted by rope makers and merchants was still trapped inside the stem. The stalk had to be taken apart. Workers first cut the plants and gathered them into bundles. Timing mattered. A plant harvested too early might produce weak fiber. Left too long, it could become coarse and difficult to process. Then came retting. The stalks were exposed to moisture so that bacteria and natural decay could loosen the tissues binding the useful outer fiber to the woody core. Some hemp was spread across damp ground and left to dew ret. Other bundles were placed in ponds, streams, or shallow water. The process demanded judgment. Remove the stalks too soon, and the fiber would not separate cleanly. Leave them too long, and the material could weaken or rot. The water could darken and smell as the plant matter decomposed. What looked like a simple agricultural crop had already become a chemical process managed by experience. After retting, the stalks had to dry. Only then could breaking begin. A worker placed a handful of dry stems across a wooden hemp brake. The hinged upper section came down repeatedly, crushing the brittle inner core while trying to preserve the long fibers around it. The motion was simple. Lift, strike, shift the bundle, strike again. But a simple motion repeated across hundreds of stalks became exhausting. Fragments of woody material fell to the ground. Dust filled the air. The workers' hands, shoulders, and back supplied the force the machine could not. The broken stalks were still not clean. They had to be scutched, scraped, or beaten so that more of the shattered core fell away. After that came heckling. The fibers were dragged through rows of metal teeth that separated, straightened, and refined them. Picture a worker holding a rough bundle in both hands. The fiber catches against the iron spikes. He pulls. Short strands and waste remain behind. He gathers the longer fibers and pulls again. A careless movement can tear the material or drive a hand into the teeth. Only after these stages could the hemp be spun into yarn or prepared for cordage. This was why colonial officials could not create a hemp industry simply by distributing seed or writing laws. The crop demanded a large amount of labor after harvest, and the quality of the final product depended on how carefully that labor was performed. Planters understood the problem. William Byrd II and Thomas Jefferson both showed interest in improving the hemp brake or reducing the difficulty of processing. A better machine promised more than convenience. It promised to extract more saleable fiber from each day of human effort. On estates such as Mount Vernon, hemp was grown for practical purposes, including rope, thread, canvas, and material used around the fisheries. But the estate did not operate through the labor of its owner alone. It existed within a plantation system, sustained by enslaved people whose work supported agriculture, construction, transport, fishing, textile production, and household operations. The surviving records often preserve the planter's decisions more clearly than the worker's experience. They tell us what was planted. They record equipment, quantities, expenses, and plans. They rarely describe what it felt like to stand beside a hemp brake for hours, to lift wet bundles from retting water, or to pull rough fibers through iron teeth. Not every stalk of colonial hemp passed through enslaved hands. Small farmers, family members, hired laborers, indentured servants, and specialized workers also participated in its production. The labor system varied by region, estate, and period. But on plantations where slavery structured daily work, hemp could become one more commodity, whose usefulness depended on people denied control over their own time. That distinction disappears easily in the finished object. A coil of rope does not reveal whether the person who prepared its fiber was paid, bound by contract, or enslaved. It does not preserve the smell of retting water, the dust from the broken core, or the repeated impact of wood against stalk. It shows only the result: strong fiber, clean strands, a material ready to be twisted, sold, and carried toward the coast. By the time hemp entered a ropewalk, most of the evidence of the field had already been removed. The leaves were gone. The stalks had been broken apart. The waste had fallen away. The labor had been stripped from the story, as completely as the woody core had been stripped from the fiber. What remained could be measured by length, strength, and price. And once war increased demand, even that rope would have to be produced faster. The crop Britain had encouraged for colonial usefulness acquired a new meaning when the colonies began resisting British rule. In the 1760s and 1770s, boycotts turned household production into political theatre. Imported cloth was no longer merely cloth. Refusing it could become a public statement. Wearing homespun signaled that a household was willing to accept rougher fabric in exchange for less dependence on British goods. Hemp entered that movement beside flax, wool, and other locally produced fibers. In April 1767, the Virginia Gazette printed front-page instructions for growing hemp. 7 years later, freeholders in Henrico County called for the encouragement of sheep, hemp, and flax, and declared that clothing made in the colony should be treated as a mark of patriotism. A crop once promoted because Britain wanted useful colonial output was now being praised because colonists wanted to need Britain less. At first, the transformation looked domestic. A family gathers around a spinning wheel. Coarse fibers are worked into thread. A finished garment is heavier than an imported textile, but it carries a political message. The fabric says dependence can be challenged. Then fighting began, and symbolism became logistics. In 1775, demand for hemp products became urgent. Armies needed sacks, fabric, lines, and other supplies. Naval forces needed cordage on a scale household production could not meet. A ship might display cannon and fly a revolutionary flag, but without rigging it remained armed timber. The Virginia Navy's brigantine Liberty required more than 2 miles of cordage. Every section had to be made from prepared fiber, twisted to the proper size, inspected, transported, and fitted to the vessel. That requirement was repeated across state-sponsored fleets and the Continental Navy. Near a wartime port, workers enter a ropewalk, a building made long and narrow because rope needs distance while it is being laid. Individual yarns stretch down the structure. Workers move backward as the strands tighten and twist together. At one end lies processed hemp. At the other, a ship is waiting. This was where agricultural fiber became military capacity. War drove hemp prices upward. Farmers who had once preferred other crops now saw an opportunity. Virginia developed at least 18 ropewalks during the conflict, including government-sponsored operations, whose commissioners used public funds to purchase hemp. But government demand did not guarantee easy supply. In 1779, Alexander Sinclair, working for the public ropewalk at Warwick, complained that sellers were demanding far above the usual price. The revolutionaries had inherited the same material problem that had troubled the empire. They wanted ships. Ships required rope. Rope required fiber, equipment, skilled work, and farmers willing to sell. Independence did not remove dependence. It rearranged it. Picture a coil of new cordage being dragged across a dock and lifted aboard a revolutionary vessel. The rope does not know which flag is above it. The same plant that had served imperial commerce can now secure a cannon, control a sail, or tow a boat fighting imperial forces. That was hemp's sharpest colonial reversal. Its value belonged to whoever could organize the land, labor, machinery, and transport required to turn stalks into usable material. Yet the language of liberty did not transform every worker into a free participant. Enslaved people still labored on farms and estates. Wage workers and artisans still faced shortages and wartime pressure. Homespun could celebrate independence while hiding unequal control over the work that produced it. Hemp helped reduce one form of dependence without ending the others beneath it. When the war ended, emergency demand declined. Ropewalks, prices, and production adjusted again. The crop that had become urgent in wartime could return to being one material among many. But its transformation had revealed something larger. A commodity developed for empire could be redirected against empire. The colonial history of hemp did not end when the ships changed flags. During the 19th century, cannabis acquired another Western identity: medicine. In Calcutta in 1839, Irish physician William Brooke O'Shaughnessy published observations on Indian cannabis after studying its effects and experimenting with preparations used for conditions including convulsions and tetanus. His work helped introduce cannabis medicines to physicians in Britain and, later, the United States. But this did not simply replace the old fiber story. It divided the plant's public identity. One branch of the story followed hemp into rope, cloth, seed, oil, paper, and industrial experiments. Another followed cannabis into pharmacies, intoxicating preparations, racialized fears, policing, and drug law. The categories were never as natural as they appeared. A plant grown tall and close together for long stalks looked different from one cultivated to produce abundant flowering material. Farmers selected varieties for different traits. Users wanted different products. Yet both belonged to the wider cannabis genus. And governments increasingly tried to turn agricultural distinctions into legal boundaries. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act placed heavy federal restrictions on cannabis in the United States. Industrial hemp was not the principal target of the public campaign against marijuana, but growers and processors were caught inside the same expanding regulatory structure. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act consolidated federal drug controls and further narrowed the space in which cannabis could be legally cultivated. The crop, once encouraged by colonial authorities, had entered a world where permission, paperwork, and criminal law could determine whether it was planted at all. Decades later, the government drew a new line. The 2018 Farm Bill created a federal framework for legal hemp production and defined hemp as cannabis containing no more than 0.3% delta, 9 THC by dry weight. Picture an inspector walking into a modern hemp field. A sample is cut, sealed, and sent to a laboratory. The leaves do not reveal what will happen next. A measurement does. Within the legal threshold, the crop can enter an agricultural market. Beyond it, the plants may face an entirely different regulatory response. The Colonial Assembly once measured hemp by the cordage it might produce. The modern state measures cannabis through chemistry, licenses, and statutory definitions. The method has changed. The power to classify the plant has not. Returned to the ship, not to the cannon, not to the flag, to the rope running through a sailor's hands. It looks simple now, twisted fiber, rough against the skin, stretched between mast, sail, deck, and sea. But inside that rope is an entire world. There is the ordinary cannabis stalk, cut from a field long before anyone argued over whether the plant was medicine, contraband, or commerce. There is the seed carried across an ocean, because distant governments wanted new land to reproduce old systems. There is the assembly that wrote hemp into law. There is the planter weighing it against tobacco. There is the worker lifting wet bundles from retting water, striking dry stalks through a wooden brake, and pulling fiber across iron teeth. Then there is the rope walk. Strands tighten. Workers step backward. A coil grows long enough to reach a waiting ship. From there, hemp enters trade, conquest, fishing, war, and revolution. The same material can serve a crown or help a colony resist it. The plant does not choose the flag. It moves wherever land, labor, law, and money force it to move. Centuries later, cannabis is still being divided by authority. One crop becomes sustainable fabric, another becomes medicine, another becomes evidence. A laboratory result, a license, or a legal definition decides which story will be told. That is what the colonial history of hemp leaves behind. Not the claim that one plant built an empire by itself. Something more revealing. Empires are held together by materials that appear too ordinary to deserve attention, and by workers whose names disappear before the finished object reaches the world. The ships have rotted. The rope has broken down. The laws have changed. But the power to decide when a plant is useful, dangerous, legal, or profitable is still with us. Cannabis did not become two different plants. It became whatever power needed it to be.